Here's a piece of advice. Do not research the Betz sphere. Not because it'll result in a shadowy government agent knocking on your door, but because this story is just an absolute nightmare to try and nail down, since no one's reports match anyone else's. So you will be left as the grizzled old drunk at the end of the bar with haunted eyes who locals whisper about because you just haven't been the same since that summer of 2026. When you gazed for long into the abyss, and the abyss gazed also into you, but did not ever cite its sources. But we do know one thing for sure. Sometime in the spring of 1974, the Betz family found a metal sphere. The Navy looked at it, scientists looked at it, reporters looked at it, and now we don't know for sure where it is. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. About 3 days ago, I returned from a long expedition across the country, only to find my fiancée at a local frolic making merry amongst the townspeople. But when I approached and asked her to dance, she looked at me with eyes that bore no hint of recognition. My overall scruffiness, it would seem, had disguised my appearance such that I looked as though I were another man entirely. Only after hearing my voice did she finally understand that it was I, her beloved, who had extended my hand to her. This told me one thing. I gotta shave. Now, if that story sounded familiar somehow, it's because it's actually from the legendary exploits of frontiersman Daniel Boone, rather than my own life. But I definitely was scruffy, especially in the neck region when I got back. Now, however, as you can see, I'm much more cleaned up, and that is thanks to this week's sponsor, Henson Shaving. Now, I've been shaving, necessarily or not, for about 12 years of my life, and in all that time, there have been a few consistent, sometimes literal, snags. A razor I only recently had bought already needed to be pressed harder against the skin in order to work, bumps being left behind even when I had lathered on the shaving cream, and the dreaded cuts which come with the territory of low-quality, poorly designed razors. You see, most people assume that the irritation you get is just part of shaving, and in fact, roughly 2/3 of men expect it as a normal outcome. But it doesn't have to be. Because as it turns out, those very same problems are shaped by how razors are generally designed. Most cartridge razors use springs, pivots, and flexible blade mounts that allow the blade to move during a shave. That movement helps the razor feel forgiving, but it also means that the blade's cutting angle changes mid-stroke, because hair offers resistance. So when a blade isn't rigidly supported, it deflects slightly before cutting through. So some hairs are cut cleanly, and others are more tugged. The result is a shave that works, but not predictably or comfortably. And instead of eliminating that blade movement, the industry built workarounds instead. Lubrication strips to reduce friction, balms to soothe irritation afterward, multiple blades to average out inconsistent cutting. And so, irritation became normalized not because it's inevitable, but because the system was designed to manage the side effects rather than remove the cause. And that's what makes Henson different. Designed by aerospace machinists, instead of allowing blade movement, Henson fully supports the blade along its cutting edge and controls blade exposure and angle using tight machining tolerances, giving you a cleaner, more comfortable shave. So, if you'd like to try out Henson for yourself and see why fighting the root cause of irritation is better than just treating the symptoms, head to the link in the description and give them a try today. Fort George Island sits on Florida's northeast coast, about 4.5 miles north to south, and roughly a half-hour's drive into Jacksonville proper. And in 1974, it was the quiet and isolated home of the Betzes, a large blended family headed by Father Antoine, a merchant ship's engineer who was often out to sea, and Mother Jerry, the owner of multiple successful businesses and pieces of land around the Jacksonville area. Of the Betz's 6 children, just a few still lived at home, including 21-year-old Terry Matthews, a pre-med student and Jerry's son from her first marriage, and at least 2 younger children, 12-year-old Wayne and 9-year-old Denise. The family lived in the middle of the woods in a mansion known as the Castle, thanks to its turreted tower, and while this would be the setting for the strange events that I'm about to describe, it wasn't the first time the home would be touched by the unbelievable. See, it was originally commissioned in the 1920s by a Chicago businessman named Nettleton Neff, who intended the Tudor Revival-style mansion to be his family's winter home. However, Nettleton's wife, Kathleen, the couple's son William, and Nettleton himself would all die within a span of just 6 years without ever stepping foot in the home. Kathleen was trapped in a house fire believed to have been caused by an exploding gas stove. If you've ever seen our episode on Ricky Jean Bryant, you're very familiar with exploding stoves. Very familiar. Shortly thereafter, 21-year-old William hanged himself from an apple tree while away at college, and eventually Nettleton took his own life in his Chicago office. After this string of tragedies left the home empty for many years, it was finally purchased by a business owner, and it served as his family's holiday retreat until he sold it to the Betzes in 1967, making the Betz family the first to live in the 21-room mansion full-time. Likely due to the house's tragic history, its isolated location in the middle of the woods, and the fact that it sat empty for so long, the mansion had developed a reputation for being haunted. One story that was passed around town was that a phone line had been installed connecting the castle to the nearby Barnett house, and according to the rumors, the phone would ring on the castle side even when no one was home to make the call from the Barnetts. In the years when the home remained vacant, locals would report hearing unexplained voices and seeing a light behind the stable randomly blinking. There were also stories about organ music playing in the house at night, despite the home not having an organ, heavy doors banging open without any obvious reason, and even kitchen items being thrown out of a cupboard and crashing to the floor during a party, despite the cupboard doors being closed when party guests ran to investigate. And even Jerry Betz admitted that when they first moved in here, there were some strange sounds that they couldn't always identify. But the strangeness wasn't finished. When it comes to this story, there are a troubling number of sources that directly contradict other sources and about really basic things, beginning with the month it all began, which was reported as both March and April of 1974, and amazingly, one blog even stated that the events began in May of 1974, before citing newspaper articles with updates on the story that are from April 1974, seemingly without noticing that their timeline had moved backward. But anyway, in the spring of 1974, Florida was experiencing a rash of fires, and Jerry owned a large piece of land whose trees she sold to the local paper mill. It was literally a cash crop, and one that Jerry was anxious to protect. In anticipation of additional fires, she had ordered a fire trail be cut, ensuring that a burning tree falling on one side of the gap wouldn't be able to reach and land on another tree and spread the fire further. And so, in March or April, but definitely not May of 1974, members of the Betz family left the castle and traveled the roughly 20 miles south to check on Jerry's cash crop. And while they were relieved to discover that the trees were safe, they noted a surprising area where the trees hadn't burned, but had been twisted somehow, like a tornado had passed over, but without ever touching down. While surveying the area, Terry Matthews, Jerry's shaggy-haired, nicely mustachioed 21-year-old son, saw something shiny about 20 yards away from this weird twisted tree area and discovered a sphere roughly the size of a bowling ball, almost 8 inches in diameter. And even though it was pretty scratched up with some scarring here and there, it was still surprisingly clean, without the caked dirt or grime you might expect from something found in the woods. It also wasn't in a crater, so it didn't appear to have fallen from a great height. When Terry picked the ball up, it was heavy and would later be found to weigh about 21.34 pounds. For comparison, most adults use bowling balls that weigh between 12 and 16 pounds. It also had a small spot on it that was darker and had a different texture than the rest of the ball, and there was a triangular marking where it looked like something had hit it. But other than that, the sphere was completely absent of any holes, seams, or marks showing it had once been attached to something else. But despite not knowing what the sphere was, the family liked it, and so Terry brought it home with him and placed it on the window seat in his bedroom. And that is where it sat, or possibly rolled around a little bit, for a few days or a few weeks. Like I said, the timelines in this story are just... they are so bad. But after a few days or a few weeks of the ball sitting there, like so many swooning co-eds sitting under a tree on the campus quad, the sphere reacted when this shaggy college boy played his guitar at it. As the story goes, Terry hit a specific chord, and the sphere was into it, seeming to buzz or give off its own frequency in response. But when Terry played that same chord again to try and get the same reaction, the ball didn't do a thing, kind of playing hard to get. Likely dismissing this whole thing as a one-off, a perfect chord played at the perfect volume to somehow create a vibration in the ball, Terry kept playing for a while until he played a different chord and the ball once again reacted. And if this was a movie, here's where the fun experiment montage would kick in, because as soon as Terry ran downstairs with the ball, the Betz family started testing out different stimuli to see how it responded. When they put Antoine's hearing aid next to it, it began chattering and making a lot of noise. When Terry hit it with something metal, it rang like a bell. When they shook it, it produced light tinkling sounds, like what you hear when shaking a burnt-out incandescent light bulb. But strangely, while it sounded like several metallic beads were inside of the sphere, they didn't behave normally when the ball was rolled. Instead of being pulled together in a cluster and following the force of motion, they seemed to be floating inside of the sphere and moving independently, regardless of how the sphere itself was moving. The Betzes knew this because, according to a Betz family member who we'll talk about in a second, you could occasionally hear them pinging off the sides as the sphere rolled around. It was thought possible that these interior objects were responsible for the sphere's surprising gyroscopic movements and the ability to roll in patterns, because the Betzes also discovered that the ball rolled in patterns. One way to put it would be that the sphere had a mind of its own, with Jerry saying that vigorously shaking the sphere and then placing it down with your hands would result in you feeling movement inside of the ball. She said it was like it's trying to get away from you. The Betzes also said that the sphere would roll around in random patterns, often changing directions before coming back near the point it started from. Sometimes it would veer one way or another before stopping altogether and just vibrating like it had a motor running inside of it. The ball also appeared to be magnetic in at least one spot, but the longer the Betz kids played with it, the more magnetic it seemed to become. They tried taking the lid from a mayonnaise jar and placing it against the sphere, but it would immediately fall off. However, the longer they played with the ball, the more the lid would stick, and with 10 or 15 more minutes of playing, the result was the lid being almost impossible to pull off. But the sphere didn't just roll around on the floor like a hamster ball. Jerry told reporters that she once placed the sphere in the center of a circular table, and according to her, no one touched the ball, and yet it began rolling. First to the edge of the glass, but stopping right before it fell off, then ultimately rolling around the perimeter and ending up back in the middle where it had started. This was a common occurrence when the sphere was placed on a table. It would roll right to the edge of the tabletop, but stop short of falling off, like a self-preservation instinct, before going back in a different direction. Now, being an engineer, Antoine was fascinated, and wanting to figure out what the hell was happening, he immediately grabbed his level and checked the table, the assumption being that the table or the floor must be slanted a little bit to cause this behavior in the sphere. The table was perfectly level. Only furthering the mystery, in an interview on the podcast Astonishing Legends, a member of the Betz family said the following, and Kurt, the sphere mood lighting. Thank you. Sometimes it would roll around for 5 minutes. Sometimes it would roll just a little ways and stop. What was really weird about it was, if you were the one that rolled it, it would come back to you. And if you moved, it would still come back to you. And we replicated that over and over again. And we kind of joked about it at first. And then we realized, well, it's not a joke. In a later write-up of the sphere, the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, would report that the sphere was more active on sunny days than cloudy ones, although the Betz family member said that she didn't remember this and believed it was likely a misunderstanding of an actual event where one of the kids took the ball outside in the Florida sun, and when they brought it back in, it was incredibly hot and took days to cool off. But speaking of write-ups and getting information incorrect, while the Betzes never contacted anyone in the press, someone outside the family, but within the Betzes' sphere, pun intended, gave a tip to the reporters, and suddenly their world just exploded. Now, this is as good a time as any to address the elephant in the room, which is attention. A family moves into a big house in the middle of a forest. The house has a tragic past and a spooky vibe. Most people like attention, and who knows, maybe they can make a little bit of money in the process. But that didn't seem to be the case with the Betzes. At all. Starting with the notion of the family inventing these stories to possibly cash in on a book or movie deal, Jerry Betz was already wealthy. I mean, they'd bought this mansion after all, and she had grown multiple businesses starting from a very young age. In fact, at the time of the Sphere incident, she was president of a real estate and land development company. Before that, she had helped an acquaintance who defaulted on his loan by taking over payments on a tractor trailer, and within a few years, she had grown that one truck into an entire trucking company. She even saved money by learning the mechanics of the trucks so that when her drivers called her from the side of the road, she could diagnose the problem herself and talk them through how to fix it instead of spending money at a shop. If that's not insane enough, there were 2 occasions where she ran the business from her hospital room after giving birth. So in other words, the Betz family was already wealthy and clearly wasn't against hard work. After all, in addition to Jerry's tenacious work ethic, Antoine was usually out on a ship and Terry was in pre-med. So these didn't seem like the quick buck type of people. And while Jerry was the one doing most of the communicating with reporters, it doesn't appear to be because she craved the attention. It seems more likely that she was the only one who was around, since Antoine was out to sea during most of this, and she was also just used to talking to people with confidence. I mean, keep in mind, she had to deal with lots of middle-aged male truckers who listened to her and trusted her. So of the Betzes, it seems that Jerry was just the one most accustomed to speaking with reporters, partially thanks to her running for Florida House of Representatives just 2 years earlier, and all of those times she appeared in the paper for other things, like suing the city to try and keep it from purchasing the local bus company and taking over its operations, which was something she felt was a waste of taxpayer money. Another cool thing about Jerry, when she was called to give deposition in this case, she refused to name her sources so that they didn't get in trouble, and said that she would continue to protect their identities even if they put her in jail. Another thing is that of the Betzes who were interviewed, which mostly seem to be Jerry, Terry, and a secret third Betz, which again we'll get to in a minute, every one of them comes across as incredibly level-headed, despite later articles about the Sphere painting the family as alien-obsessed. Jerry was once interviewed by the Jacksonville Journal in a Halloween piece about her purportedly haunted mansion, and even in an article geared toward the spooky, Jerry stayed pragmatic, telling the reporter that she and her family always tried to find logical explanations for spooky happenings, explaining away the area's glowing fog as likely being the result of substantial phosphorus in the water seeping into the surrounding soil. The reporter also stated that despite rumors about hauntings surrounding the house, Mrs. Betz found most to be untrue. Similarly, when Terry first discovered the ball, Jerry stated in an interview, "It probably has a very simple explanation, but so far I haven't found anyone that can give me one." But perhaps the largest sign pointing to the Betz family being genuine in their curiosity about this sphere is the fact that they stopped talking about the sphere altogether. When the attention became crazy and their good reputation in the community, especially Jerry's, turned into mocking headlines, they simply stopped speaking, rather than doubling down or claiming that they'd made it up. Didn't seem like Jerry or any of the Betzes had anything to prove, so they eventually just let themselves fade into the background. But there's one more thing I want to mention before diving back into the chaos, and that's one of the sources used in this episode. In 2019, the podcast Astonishing Legends interviewed a woman who claimed to be a member of the Betz family, who had been present when the sphere was first discovered, as well as during many of the instances where the sphere behaved strangely. The host of the podcast said that they'd verified her identity, although unfortunately they didn't expand on exactly how they did this. Later on, the family member would send some documents that would be pretty hard to fake, like government correspondence from the 1970s, family letters, that kind of thing. That being said, there were a couple of moments during this guest's interviews where she said things in a strange way, such as when she talked about the Betz family as external to herself, saying things like, "The Navy visited the Betzes," which is weird if you're one of the Betzes. You'd normally say the Navy visited us. She also calls Jerry by her first name, which again is kind of weird if she was one of the Betz's kids, but was probably a way to ensure her own anonymity, since calling Jerry Mom or Aunt Jerry would give things away. Also, the hosts insisted that this anonymous family member wasn't Jerry, and she sounded too young to be Jerry anyway. We're not going to try and out her, though, since it's clear that this entire family largely wants to stay private. But here's why I'm bringing this up. During her interviews, the purported Betz family member directly refutes reports written in newspapers at the time of the event. For example, an article from April 15, 1974, claims that Jerry was trying to get the sphere insured through Lloyd's of London. But this anonymous family member said that was completely fabricated and that the family never had the ball insured. This wouldn't be the first time contemporary reports got something wrong, and given the mocking tone that some of the articles took, it's not too surprising that reporters may have added some extra flair or assumed the story was about a kook and didn't bother to take very detailed notes. But it leaves us in a strange place where we have to choose between believing what the papers wrote or believing an anonymous person who claims to be a Betz family member and witnessed the events firsthand, but whose identity we cannot confirm for ourselves. So here's what we're going to do from this point forward. When you see the 3 dots in the bottom corner here, that means we're giving a direct quote. That's also always the case, by the way. If you see 3 dots in the bottom corner, that indicates that I'm reading a quote. What is unique to this video specifically is that if a major piece of information I'm giving comes from the anonymous family member only, and could not be corroborated by any other reports from the time or other primary sources, you'll see this symbol. so you'll know that this is just coming from this Betz family member. Frankly, she sounded legit, and nothing she said rang false, per se, so we're not saying not to believe her. We just believe in being transparent about where our information is coming from. Getting back to the story, now that the press had gotten wind of this mysterious object, the Betz's lives instantly changed. For one, their phone rang nonstop, which was crazy back then, but that's just normal now, because some guy in India really needs to sell you a life insurance policy. Anyway, the phone began ringing nonstop, random people began camping in the vast woods surrounding the castle, and others tried to break into the house. So this would have been terrifying for the family, and to the point where a police officer in the Betz's extended family began acting as their personal security. Unfortunately, things only got worse because the story went international, and the Betz's became so famous that a letter addressed only to Betz Ball, United States, actually got to them. It also arrived postage due and said to Terry, "You long-haired freak, cut your hair and get a job." So Terry had to pay to get insulted, which is admittedly a little funny. Now, unfortunate as all of that would have been, there is one silver lining to this amount of attention, which would be that if you got this many people in one place, surely somebody would witness something strange. Somebody outside of the Betz family would be able to say, yeah, we saw it do this weird thing, right? Well, according to Jerry, a reporter who came to the house placed the sphere on the floor and rolled it away from himself, after which it rolled in a second direction and then went back toward the reporter before it stopped and began vibrating. Although Jerry didn't give the name of the reporter, it seems that this story is about Jacksonville Journal photographer Lou Egner, who gave one of the more famous quotes about the sphere, telling the paper, "I'm leery of this kind of thing. When I got there, Mrs. Betz said, 'You won't believe this if you don't see it.' She told me to put it on the floor and give it a push. It rolled a ways and stopped. So what? She said, 'Just wait a minute.' It turned by itself and rolled to the right about 4 feet. It stopped. Then it turned again and rolled to the left about 8 feet, made a big arc, and came right back to my feet. He then called it the darndest thing I'd ever saw. It seems to have a life of its own." Now, Lou Egner didn't say anything about the sphere vibrating, and I'm not sure if photographers are sometimes called reporters, but considering this quote is about a ball moving on its own around at least one impartial witness, with that witness confirming it, we're willing to let those two inconsistencies go. Aiden, you have a journalism degree. Are photographers ever referred to as reporters, accidentally?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, the answer is yes. That can happen. He has a journalism degree from NYU. But if scattered media reports and various, claims from people who may or may not be part of the Betz family are, hard to go by, things did change. You see, the family learned something new about the ball when a TV crew came to film it. And to show the scale of the sphere, the Betzes put their toy poodle next to it. And that is when they claimed the dog started whimpering and covering her ears with her paws, behavior that Jerry said she had never seen from the dog before, which made them wonder if the sphere was producing a high-frequency sound that their very good girl was hearing. And perhaps that particular part of media insanity, but also just the general hubbub overall, is probably how the US Navy heard about the Betz sphere. The Navy was interested in taking a look at the ball, and Jerry allowed it, since her goal was to figure out what the hell this thing is, and this was a very solid step towards doing that. On April 11th of 1974, a Navy representative picked up the ball for testing, with Jerry telling them that she expected a full and comprehensive report on the sphere within 2 weeks, and if it can't be identified as government property, it is to be returned. Essentially, you can't take forever, and if it's not yours, give it back, which are important things to say to the government, who typically will not give it back. Jerry also expanded on this interaction in the Jacksonville Journal, telling reporter Helen Betz, "And if they tell us it belongs to the Air Force or some other government agency, they're going to have to come to a separate agreement with us. We aren't just handing this over with no questions asked. After all, there's still a lot of legal weight in that old saying about finders being keepers." Now, it appears that the Navy only had the sphere for a few days, and while their first attempts at X-raying the object failed, thanks to the X-ray machine not being powerful enough, they finally did get a stronger machine, and with it, solid X-ray images. Chief Petty Officer Chris Berninger said that there was certainly something odd about the sphere, and admitted that he had seen the ball move away by itself at the Betz's home, although he attributed these movements to the Betz's old, uneven stone floors. He did say the sphere was almost perfectly balanced, and as a result, the smallest indentation could make it move or change direction. Additionally, he reported that the ball was 8 inches in diameter and hollow, with its shell being a half-inch thick and made from high-grade but common stainless steel 431, that the sphere had a magnetic field and wasn't radioactive, explosive, or otherwise hazardous. He also confirmed that the sphere did not have any seams and that the only external marking was a small triangle. When it came to the items inside the sphere, the movement Jerry said she felt after shaking it, Berninger stated that they were actually small beads of residue that had been left over from manufacturing. And while he couldn't identify who this manufacturer was, he was fairly confident that they were Earth-based. Furthermore, a metallurgist from the Jacksonville Naval Air Station had also performed spectrograph and X-ray tests and claimed that the sphere was made of a high-grade stainless steel alloy, but he said that it didn't contain anything inside. According to the Navy, their official opinion on the subject was that the sphere was a large ball bearing used in a piping system's check valve. A check valve ensures that liquid only flows one way and not back out. So the ball will sit flush against the opening to block the liquid from moving backward. But when the Navy officer returned the sphere to the Betzes, something pretty interesting happened. He returned it with a manila envelope that Jerry later discovered contained the actual X-rays. And this was very likely a mistake. According to the anonymous Betz family member, as Jerry was waiting for CPO Berninger to bring the sphere back, her phone rang, and it was the Navy. They asked her if Berninger was there, and Jerry said he was not. Could she have Berninger call them back as soon as he arrived, please? The Navy asked, and she said that she could. Then, after Berninger returned the ball, seemingly along with the accidental X-ray inclusion, she gave him the message. He called his contact at the Navy, and what followed was a lot of yes sirs, no sirs, and I'll try sirs. Then Berninger asked Jerry if he could please have the sphere back. Jerry said no, and that was that. However, this accounting of the story might be incorrect. It is possible that the military wanted the X-rays back and not the sphere, because a few years later, the Florida Times-Union quoted Jerry as saying, after the Navy said there were no seams and nothing of significance inside, they asked for the X-rays they had given us back. They had first said we could keep the X-rays, then they said the X-rays we had to be taken to another government facility. So, chalking this little bit of confusion up as par for the course when it came to researching this entire topic, a couple of things do ring false about this part of the story. Mostly the Navy being able to get through on the phone, despite the fact that the house phone was said to be ringing off the hook 24 hours a day, which is something Jerry spoke to reporters about with frustration. There was no call waiting back then, so if someone was already on the phone, you got a busy signal and had to hang up and try again. So it's unclear how the Navy was able to get a hold of her seemingly pretty easily. And it's also kind of surprising that the military complied with their agreement to return the sphere. Nothing against the military in general, but would you trust the government to return something they borrowed from you? However, what does sound realistic is an absolutely mundane mistake like accidentally including the X-rays with the sphere and returning both to Jerry. I mean, every workplace has that one person that's not great at reading all of the details of an assignment, and I don't think the military is any different in that respect. Every office has that, one guy. But none of that answers a more important question, which is, what did Jerry and the anonymous family members see when they looked at the X-rays? Well, they said that the interior of the sphere was hollow, about the size of an orange, and the shell had gradations to it. There was no seam and no fill point, raising questions as to how the smaller balls got into the larger one. Again, though, at least one newspaper report very clearly stated there was a tiny round spot with a different texture inside of the ball, something that a later UFO journal would verify, so we have yet more conflicting information. For her part, Jerry said that the interior spheres appeared to be of a denser material than that which made up the outside, stating that they were told the inside had to be either titanium, uranium, or plutonium. And while Jerry said that the X-rays showed a little antenna coming out of one of the spheres, the anonymous family members said there were multiple wires, although the X-rays showed only one filament. Additional testing would require cutting the sphere open, which the Betzes didn't want to do just yet. By the way, we were able to find pictures of the X-rays. They are out there, and that's because they're some of the documents this anonymous Betz family member provided to the host of Astonishing Legends. We reached out to ask if we could include them in the video, but we didn't hear back, so we decided we were just going to give you screenshots from their podcast, making it very clear that it's from their podcast, and once again tell you that this is from Astonishing Legends. As you can see, the pictures are surprisingly disappointing. Like, whatever you might have been imagining before right now, rein it in. And this isn't a dig at the Astonishing Legends host, by the way. They did a great job bumping up the contrast and getting the images in the first place. Just with everything in the story leading up to the X-rays, you would expect more than this. Anyway, perhaps the hardest part of this story to nail down is a person named Dr. Carl Williston, who supposedly worked at a Baton Rouge-based research firm called Omega-1, but who is also reportedly a professor at the University of Florida. Now, I want to be clear, that's possible. People hold research positions while also holding professorships. Like, there's not necessarily anything weird about that. And given the regional closeness of those two institutions, that's possible. That's not necessarily an inconsistency. Regardless, on Saturday, April 13th, 1974, Williston traveled to the Betz's and studied the sphere in person for about 6 hours. While he seems to have largely confirmed what the Navy reported, such as the sphere being made of stainless steel alloy, he clarified that it wasn't totally alloy 431. There was something else in there, and he couldn't identify it. He also added that the sphere emitted radio waves, and that it was surrounded by a magnetic field that fluctuated, something that would normally require a power source. As for the Omega-1 Institute, no one seems to know anything about that. Omega- is the name of a subatomic particle discovered in the 60s, but when it comes to the Institute itself, we're gonna go ahead and gently place it in the who the f*** knows pile. Just right over there. Put it on top of everything else. But while Dr. Carl Williston seems to have been the first non-Navy scientist to reach out to the Betz's, he would be far from the last. Famed UFO investigator J. Allen Hynek had gotten in touch with the family, curious about the sphere and wanting to see it in person. At that time, Hynek was an astronomer at Northwestern University, but he had also been part of 3 different UFO studies within the U.S. Air Force: Project Sign, Project Grudge, and, most famously, Project Blue Book. He began these studies as a skeptic, which seemed to be what the Air Force wanted from him, but he eventually changed his opinion and began to study UFOs in earnest, coming up with the famous Close Encounter scale 2 years before the sphere events. Later, in 1977, this scale would be made even more famous in Steven Spielberg's film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, on which Hynek would serve as a consultant and have a pretty solid walk-on role. Over time, Dr. Hynek would go on to become a family friend, staying over at the Betz's house, sitting up late into the night telling them stories about aliens, and even admitting to them that the US government had bodies retrieved from a downed spacecraft, which the anonymous Betz family member believes was a reference to Roswell. According to this family member, Hynek told them, "There's just so much that you don't know, and so much that people feel like, if people did know, that it would destroy people's religious beliefs. It would panic people, because then all of a sudden, it's not just us, and we're not the superior being. We're a speck." It's just kind of wild. They've been saying the exact same thing for 50 years, and it never changes. Nor do I understand this whole "it would destroy people's religious beliefs" thing. I don't know why they're saying that. I don't think it would. Some suggested reading for why aliens shouldn't destroy at least one religion. I recommend reading Dr. Michael Heiser's work, beginning with The Unseen Realm. That out of the way, though, along with being a friend, the Betz's would come to view Hynek as a trusted advisor, despite a little hiccup on their first meeting. Hynek had traveled to the castle to see the sphere for himself, and depending on the version of the story you believe, either Hynek specifically requested to spend the night with the ball, or Jerry caught him running tests on the ball overnight without her permission. Both versions seem to agree that the bag he'd brought didn't just have, his jammies and a toothbrush, but also contained equipment to run tests. But either way, when the tests were outed, he confessed to Jerry that he needed to get shavings from the ball's surface to try and figure out exactly what the metal was. But the metal itself was too hard to get any samples there at the house. So Jerry eventually allowed him to get better sampling, and when the shavings were tested, they reportedly came back with an atomic number that was far higher than anything scientists knew about. According to the Betz family, Dr. Hynek consistently felt that the sphere was not man-made, but rather was something from outer space. And put a pin in that one. Now, a week after the Navy had taken the sphere for testing, it turns out a second sphere actually showed up, this time reported by a woman named Lottie Robinson, who said she'd had the sphere in her garage for several years, but didn't report any strange happenings during that time. Now, her sphere was a little bit smaller than the Betz's at 20 pounds and just not quite as big around. And also, unlike the Betz sphere, Lottie's was immediately identified. According to the St. Regis Company, a paper mill in Jacksonville, the sphere was part of a valve that had once been used when moving corrosive liquids. although they'd stopped using that type of valve about 15 years earlier, which was, according to Lottie, around the same time her son was gifted the ball. This bothered the Betz family. This new sphere didn't look anything like theirs, for one, and more importantly, the Robinson ball didn't move on its own, and yet the papers were quick to use this second sphere as a reason to portray the Betzes as just an eccentric family locked into the idea of aliens. Only adding to the growing chaos, Jerry had been getting pestered by the National Enquirer, which was putting more and more pressure on her to let them see the sphere. So Dr. Hynek, who had an existing relationship with the tabloid paper, which is never a good sign, offered to be their liaison. And by the middle of April, they'd all come to a written agreement. Instead of sending them the sphere alone, which Jerry didn't feel comfortable doing, the tabloid would send a private jet to fly Terry and the sphere, tucked securely in a bowling ball bag, first to the Enquirer's headquarters, and then on to New Orleans for the National Enquirer's blue ribbon panel of UFO investigators. I'm trying, guys. I'm trying to take this seriously. But what's important that you note here is that the agreement also stipulated that Terry needed to stay with the ball at all times. So put a pin in that one too. Again, gotta remember that Dr. Hynek said that the ball was not man-made and was from outer space, and we gotta remember that Terry was supposed to stay with the ball at all times. But just to kind of roll back for a second here so we can explain why the National Enquirer had a blue ribbon panel of UFO investigators, back in 1972, so 2 years before this, the National Enquirer announced a standing offer, which was $50,000 for the first person to produce an object that provably came from space and was not a naturally occurring phenomenon. In support of this offer, and to sell more papers, the Enquirer had then established a panel of legitimate academics who they called their Blue Ribbon Panel of UFO Investigators. And these were the people who would be called on to take a look at the submitted space items. This panel consisted of the aforementioned Dr. Hynek, as well as Dr. James Harder, a civil and hydraulic engineering professor and director of research at the University of California, Berkeley, who was also part of APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization. It also had Dr. Leo Sprinkle, which is one hell of a name, let me tell you that, who was a psychologist at the University of Wyoming, who had also studied UFO contactees. There was Dr. Frank Salisbury, a professor of plant physiology at Utah State, and Professor Robert Cregan, chairman of the Department of Philosophy at the State University of New York at Albany. And while it's a bit confusing why legitimate scientists would risk their reputations associating with a tabloid newspaper, it seems like they had all of their expenses paid during these once or twice a year meetups, and it was probably a pretty fun and a good excuse to just meet up with other people who are interested in the subject like you are. You know, other UFO academics, people studying not necessarily the UFOs themselves, but the stories of them and where they might be coming from and what they might mean. And as far as the Betz sphere was concerned regarding this blue ribbon panel, no mention was made anywhere of the Betzes going for the cash prize. Instead, it seems like the National Enquirer pursued them, feeling that this UFO seminar would make a great opportunity to have all these collective minds take a look at the sphere at once. And again, sell newspapers to people who wanted to see the crazy magic ball. Oh, and APRO was going to send somebody to run additional tests on the sphere, so that's just a win-win for everybody. Thus, on April 16, 1974, Terry and the sphere were flown to the National Enquirer headquarters in Lantana, Florida, and while it's not super clear where the following event happened, it seems like it was there in the tabloid's offices. According to the unnamed Betz family member, people obviously wanted to see what the sphere could do, and so they had a piece of plexiglass that was kind of laid at an angle like a ramp. So Terry set the sphere down on the bottom of the plexiglass ramp, and it rolled uphill from a dead standstill, then rolled back down, and finally stopped. This family member said that many people saw it and that it was filmed, but the footage from this and the actual UFO event in New Orleans was all seized. And again, the timing of this whole story is kind of hard to figure out. This next bit happened either at the National Enquirer headquarters or at the UFO panel a few days later, but at some point, Terry was pulled aside and told there had been an accident back home, and his mom was trying to get a hold of him. This news obviously panicked Terry, and he tried to call his mom, but of course the phones were ringing off the hook and he couldn't get through, so he jumped on a plane and flew home. But when he got back to the castle and saw Jerry, she was very confused and asked him what the hell he was doing home and where was the sphere. Terry explained that when he got her message about needing him, the sphere had been in the middle of getting investigated, so he'd left it behind. But Jerry, who clearly hadn't suffered any accident, told Terry, get back there now. Now, the crux of this issue isn't just that the sphere was God knows where with God knows who having God knows what done to it. It also seems to be that Terry was deliberately separated from the sphere. According to the hosts of Astonishing Legends, the language of the agreement between the Betzes and National Enquirer stipulated that Terry had to stay with the ball. Now that he left, it implied that the Betzes had been tricked into breaking the agreement. Anyway, the next day, which appears to be April 17th, but who knows anymore, the Betzes divide and conquer. Terry gets on a plane back to the National Enquirer's offices in Lantana, while other Betzes, including at least one of their older daughters, jump in the car and make the 4.5-hour trip south to meet up with Terry. If this happened in Lantana. If this happened in New Orleans during the Blue Ribbon Panel, they drove 8 hours west to Louisiana. Regardless, when Terry gets back and demands the ball and the written agreement from the guys at the National Enquirer, they become super squirrely. They won't let him see the sphere. Things get very heated, and it's not even clear if the ball is on the premises anymore. Finally, though, it's agreed that Terry can be reunited with the ball at the Blue Ribbon Panel in New Orleans on the 20th. Or if this confrontation happened in New Orleans on the 20th, then Terry can have the sphere the second day of the seminar, which would be the 21st. So either 3 days later or the following day, Terry gets into the seminar and finds out there are all kinds of officials there. People from the Navy and seemingly other acronyms as well. The Blue Ribbon Panel is sitting at a long table in the front of the room, and Terry joins them when it's time for the sphere to be reviewed. There aren't many pictures from that event. Remember, they were reportedly seized, but there are a few, and you can see Terry, who is the most 1970s-looking guy to ever exist, sitting with the men and the sphere. There's also a video of Terry sort of uncomfortably spinning the ball on a table in front of him, showing that it was scratched up and had that triangular shape on the top, but that it didn't have any seams or manufacturing markings. The ball did not perform for the panel. In the podcast Oddball, host Lindsay Kilbride interviewed Dr. Leo Sprinkle, the psychologist from the panel with the most whimsical name ever, who very sincerely admitted that he had no memory of the Betz sphere at all, and while this may be the result of Dr. Sprinkle's age, it also isn't a terribly good testament to the impression the ball made on the scientists. Even though Dr. Hynek confirmed this lack of memorable findings when he appeared on a Seattle radio show the day after the New Orleans event, saying, "There's no evidence whatsoever that either I or the other members of the UFO panel can find that would indicate it is extraterrestrial. That doesn't, of course, absolutely prove it isn't, but there is no obvious evidence. For instance, if it had come from outer space, it undoubtedly would have some sort of that ablation or burn marks on it, and it seems like a perfectly normal metal sphere." The Seattle host also asked if the ball moved by itself or not, and Hynek said, no, it only moved when you moved it yourself. And of course, one thing it does is it's fairly heavy as it moves along. It unbalances the table. It presses down a little bit. And it might seem, if a table weren't completely level, it might seem to be moving itself. Of course, we know that, according to the anonymous family member, as soon as Terry showed the Betzes how strange the sphere was acting, one of the first things Antoine did was check the tables to see if they were level, which, according to her, they were. But the Blue Ribbon Panel stated that the sphere was an iron alloy with 3 small balls inside of it, and that it firmly originated on Earth. Now remember, this is the first time Terry has had access to the sphere since he was prank called into flying home without it, and now he needed to get it back. And this is how he reportedly did it. A reporter asked Terry if the ball did something cool. Terry said, "Yeah, let me show you. This is awesome. You're gonna freak out." He marches up to the table, grabs the ball, and runs out the back door. And this escape appears to have been protected by the fact that reporters were in the room, so any officials who wanted to stop him would look very suspicious tackling a hippie for taking his own ball that the UFO experts just said wasn't special. As for why they didn't, grab him once he was outside, well, Terry's sisters, having driven to the event, were waiting, and once Terry had the ball, he jumped in their car and they all left. And while officials might have made attempts to stop Terry at the airport, those attempts were useless because he wasn't there. But something was wrong now. The ball didn't do what it used to do. The Betz family member said that the ball was the same, as in it had the same markings they knew to look for and even the same spot where J. Allen Hynek had scraped away some of the shell for testing, but it no longer moved around by itself, as if whatever mechanism that had been inside it had been destroyed. And this is another part of the story where versions seem to differ, because the anonymous relative's statement that the sphere itself was the same, just broken, is unique, as the more common version is that the ball was completely replaced. Regardless, Jerry paid to have the sphere x-rayed again, and the resulting images confirmed what they had suspected. Something was very, very different. The x-rays showed that the ball suddenly had seams, as if it had been cut open, and one of the smaller balls on the inside appeared to have been pulverized. At first, Jerry was livid, but then she became scared, realizing that someone, likely the government, didn't want her to know about or have whatever this thing was. This belief was bolstered by the strange people who had begun contacting Jerry, including those who claimed to be from a Louisiana firm involved in geothermal energy, who offered the Betzes $500,000 to purchase the sphere. And when Jerry asked if they'd pay $750,000 just to see what their reaction would be, they said yes without batting an eye. She actually turned down the offer, which again would suggest, if this story is true about the offer, that whatever the Betzes thought was going on with the sphere, there was genuine belief there. As for everybody else, it's harder to say. By this point, the Betzes were also getting a weird feeling about Hynek, seemingly brought on, at least in part, by the difference between how excitedly he spoke to them about the sphere in private and then his own public statements after the Blue Ribbon panel. In November of 1974, he told Indiana newspaper The Republic that he had only examined the sphere that one time in Louisiana at the National Enquirer panel, and then he gets snippy, telling the reporter, "I read that I was supposed to receive the thing from those people, but I've never got it. I've lost all interest." This seems to be a reference to an original request Hynek had made to the Betzes that they crate up the sphere and mail it to him in Chicago, something that they didn't feel comfortable doing. However, he had made this request before the New Orleans panel, so it's unclear why it was brought up in this November article 6 months after the panel. Also, the thing and those people are very dismissive terms for a family that he had, at least according to them, become very close with. And even if they had misinterpreted his behavior, he still appeared to be lying when he said that he'd only seen the ball that one time, as two different people in Jerry's life confirmed to podcast host Lindsay Kilbride that J. Allen Hynek had come to Florida separately to investigate the ball. And while the anonymous family members stated that the sphere changed after the National Enquirer had it, Jerry told a reporter that the ball stopped moving on its own after Hynek had studied it at their house. Either way, though, Jerry reportedly felt that Hynek had been involved, with the family members saying that there was something about him Jerry did not trust, and she felt very uncomfortable with. And she felt like in the end, when the ball was taken and everything done to it, she felt like he had a lot to do with it, and that he knew more than he was telling. It felt as though he was their friend, but that he also had his own agenda. By the time the National Enquirer panel was done, Jerry and her family were growing sick of the nonstop media surrounding the sphere. Keep in mind, this all happened over the span of 1 month. Terry found the sphere near the end of March or the beginning of April, and the National Enquirer panel happened on April 20th and 21st. So Jerry was exhausted by this point, telling the Associated Press, "We came to Fort George Island to get away to a serene atmosphere. Now I can't get away from the telephone. It means nothing to people in the West that it's midnight here, and when they quit calling, those in the East wake up and start." And now that Jerry had seen these new x-rays confirming that the ball had been either switched or damaged, she was also frightened, especially once she learned that her phones had been tapped, something she believed had been done by J. Allen Hynek during one of his visits. In addition to all of that, the family had apparently been cautioned to be careful about who they allowed to examine the sphere, with Terry saying that one of the groups who cautioned them was NASA. Another was believed to be Dr. James Harder from the same Blue Ribbon panel, who the Betzes felt had his own reservations about Dr. Hynek and his motives. All of this is to say is that Jerry was scared and felt like she should burn the x-rays to get rid of all the proof, which it sounds like that's what she did. I think it's fair to say that the timeline for this story is infuriating even on its best days. However, after the National Enquirer event, it seems that Dr. James Harder continued to be interested in the sphere, while Dr. Hynek distanced himself from it, at least publicly. By June of 1974, Jerry had told papers that she no longer had the sphere in her possession, and while the Betz family still owned it, their lawyer had advised them to refrain from discussing its whereabouts. Several years later, Jerry admitted to reporter William Martin that she had wanted the media circus to die down, so they eventually lied and said that they had sold it. And by November, around the time that Hynek was saying that there was nothing to be made of the ball, everything seems to have ground to a halt. The tests that had been run up to that point showed that the sphere was probably man-made, but they still hadn't had any luck finding out exactly what it was or where it was made, because different people told them different things after examining the sphere. But when an Indiana newspaper contacted Terry, who Jerry Betz had always insisted owned the sphere since he was the one who found it, things got strange. He said that the state of Florida is trying to claim the thing. Anything of value which is found here is considered property of the state. We've been offered $750,000 for it, and that's why the state wants it. So they were in this limbo of trying to establish legal ownership of the sphere before letting anyone else take it to study it. They wanted to make sure they got it back again. But as far as figuring out where this ball originated, they didn't know much more in November than they knew back in April. More timeline confusion comes in because despite Dr. Hynek's salty comments about them in the sphere, the Betzes still seem to pin their hopes on him, as Terry mentions him in this same article, hoping that Hynek can help explain these short waves said to be coming from the ball. They knew that many researchers wanted to cut into it, but they wanted Dr. Hynek to have another look before they allowed that to happen, which is weird because remember, one version of the story has Jerry suspecting that Dr. Hynek stole the sphere and replaced it with a replica, or at least had its insides destroyed. Speaking of that suspicion, there's a bizarre coda to this entire story. In 2019, the History Channel aired a scripted series called Project Blue Book, and during its production, one of J. Allen Hynek's sons, Paul, acted as the production supervisor. So when the show came out, Paul did an interview with his hometown paper where he drops a random mention in the last paragraph of the article. I found out recently that a big silver sphere we had was from some famous UFO case in Florida. We would just kick it around the floor because we didn't know what it was. And it's fair to presume that at the moment that came out, a small group of people with the same niche interests' heads all exploded. You see, during Paul Hynek's appearance on the Oddball podcast, he said that the sphere was heavy, and his brother remembered that it was hollow and seemed to have something jingly inside it when you shook it. However, he did not remember a triangular chip and said it was bigger than a basketball, whereas the Betz sphere was smaller than a basketball. Ultimately, Paul Hynek didn't even know if it was the same sphere. By the way, if you want a glimpse into how maddening it is to research the Betz sphere, here's this. On the Oddball podcast, Lindsay Kilbride tries to hone in on more specifics of the ball that Paul Hynek and his brothers played with as kids, and it's a lesson in futility, because a different brother tells Kilbride that he remembered it being an industrial ball bearing, and that something moved inside when you rolled it. And he also remembered a third brother, Joel, being the one to bring it home, not their father, but then Joel said that it wasn't him who brought it home, it was their dad. Then the second brother said he actually remembered 2 spheres, but Joel only remembered 1, and while he thinks an old friend may have taken it, he can't ask because that friend is dead now. But since Kilbride had Paul Hynek on the phone, she asked him about the difference between what his dad reportedly told the Betzes, that he believed the sphere could be extraterrestrial, and his public statements that it seems like a perfectly normal metal sphere. When she asked if that sounded like him, kind of presenting 2 different opinions depending on the audience, Paul responded, "It's certainly possible. I think what I heard my father say was always, it's hard for someone to speak in definite terms. This is extraterrestrial, for example. I think he'd be more inclined to say, this is quite mysterious, or I've had a metallurgical analysis done of this and we can't place its origin. Things like that. I can imagine that he would be a little looser with his verbiage with the people that reported it than in the public. That being said, being a little looser in your verbiage with the Betz family is different than saying publicly, those people were supposed to send it, they didn't, I've lost interest. And this is kind of where you find yourself needing to pick a side. Taking everything you know about Jerry and the rest of the Betzes, everything you know about recent admissions regarding UAPs and military personnel seeing inexplicable things, and everything you know about aircraft that were once viewed as alien, which turned out to be advanced military tech, and ask yourself, what do you think happened? Did the Betzes find something exceedingly mundane that the press, eager for something new and interesting, blew out of proportion? Or did they find something truly mysterious? One of the most popular theories as to the origin of the Betz sphere is that it's part of a ball check valve. In mid-April of 1974, so smack dab in the middle of the chaos, a man named Robert B. Edwards, who was the president of an equipment supply firm in Jacksonville, said that they stole stainless steel balls that are nearly identical to the one the Betzes described. The spheres in question were manufactured by a division of the company Bell and Howell in Connecticut, and the Jacksonville supplier sold them to one industry only, pulp paper mills. The mills needed to feed acid and other highly dangerous corrosive liquids into a digester tank, where the wood chips were turned into pulp, and one of the steel balls was part of that system's valve. Now, Edwards admitted that he had never seen the Betz's sphere, per se, so he couldn't positively identify it as one of theirs, but he did weigh one of his company's spheres, and it weighed a little over 21 pounds, which was the same weight the Navy measured for the Betz sphere. The general manager of Industrial Tectonics Incorporated, a company out of Michigan that manufactured metal products, said that the ball sounded to him like a part commonly used as either pistons or check valves in chemical pumps. However, an article written in 1977, almost 3 years after the initial press action, clarified that none of the businessmen who claimed the ball was likely from a paper mill ever actually examined it up close. But remember, Antoine was an engineer, and maybe surprisingly, he also initially believed the sphere was part of a ball valve. But then he talked to some colleagues at the shipyard, and they didn't know what a ball valve that big would be used for. And if it was used in a paper mill, they couldn't imagine why you'd have one that weighed that much. Now, it should be remembered that Edwards had weighed one of his company's spheres and found that it was the same weight, so that could be an issue of just the guys at the shipyard aren't part of the paper industry. That being said, other ball valves used in paper mills had seams and were about 5 to 7 pounds, and according to the anonymous Betz family member, Antoine straight up spoke to employees at the St. Regis paper mill, and those employees said that they had never used anything like that, which would go against what Edwards said. But perhaps the most popular explanation for how the sphere got into those woods in the first place brings us to New Mexico. Near the end of April, a Coca-Cola delivery man was outside the Sagebrush Inn in Taos, New Mexico, when he spotted an orb nearly identical to the Betz sphere, which he'd read about in the news. He quickly found the hotel's manager, a man named James Durling Jones, and alerted him to the sphere, but Durling Jones wasn't surprised. See, Durling Jones wasn't just a hotel manager, he was also a sculptor, and 3 years earlier, so 1971, he'd been driving with 12 similar misbegotten stainless steel balls of 2 sizes loaded into a box on top of his VW bus, as he intended to incorporate them into sculptures, including using one as a pendulum for a clock. When he got home, some of them were missing, and he believed that the balls on the bus went round and round until some of them fell out of the box on the roof and rolled down to God knows where. His belief was further bolstered by the fact that he had passed through the Jacksonville, Florida area around Easter of 1971. The artist admitted that he was kind of a sphere freak, which is probably the first time anyone had ever said that, and confirmed the similarities between his spheres and the Betz's. Of the 2 sizes he had, one version had an 8-inch diameter, was hollow, and weighed 22 pounds almost exactly. He also confirmed that the shaking of the spheres produced a metallic rattle, the result of the companies trying to patch the spheres by drilling and rewelding them. However, he stated that his balls were slightly out of round, and if they had been perfect, they'd be worth several $1,000s to the company that made them. A company that he wouldn't name because it would get his yet unnamed friend in trouble, although he clarified that the spheres weren't stolen. And for the record, they totally sound stolen. Especially because the guy refused to say what the spheres were supposed to be for, because if I tell you, then the company will want them back. He did say they were part of an industrial valve, like the ones used in high-pressure transmission lines. So on the one hand, we have some stuff here that very much sounds like it could have been the origin of the ball. On the other hand, the fact that these not-so-stolen spheres were imperfectly round is in contrast to what the Navy said about the Betz sphere, which was that it was almost perfectly balanced. And similar to the issue with the ball check valve guys, it doesn't seem like Durling Jones ever compared the 2 spheres in person, because when Jerry Betz spoke with the sculptor on the phone and asked if he would mail one of the spheres to her, he said he wasn't sure if he wanted to. And that seems to have been the end of that. But at first, the idea that a few spheres bounced off the top of the Volkswagen bus and launched their sizable weight down an embankment and into the woods sounds like a solid explanation for what they were and how they got there. However, according to the anonymous member of the Betz family, the area where the ball was found was so far away from any road that it required driving down a logging trail and then hiking further into the woods. For reference, this was around the current intersection of Fay Road and Alta Drive in northeast Jacksonville, although the area is more built up now. The unlikelihood of the spheres ending up that far away in the woods was also validated by the Oddball podcast. And just logistically, it's also a little hard to believe that at least one, if not multiple, 22-pound balls coming off the top of a moving vehicle wouldn't cause significant damage, or worse, to other drivers and automobiles on the highway. Like, that is some Final Destination right there. But as far as our research showed, there aren't any reports of metallic balls causing traffic incidents in the spring of 1971 in that area. So, let's talk about space balls. In 2001, a sphere of 14 inches wide slammed into an area of grassland in Namibia, leaving behind a crater 13 inches deep. This turned out to be a hydrazine bladder tank, which is a spherical portion of a spacecraft that contains a flexible bladder with propellant inside. The thing about these tanks, though, is that they require a way for the propellant to come out, which means that some type of pipe, coupling, or other external piece needs to be attached to the sphere. The one that landed in Namibia, for example, had nubs on either end that clearly connected to something else at some time. Crucially, it also had a very clear seam around its center where the two halves were welded together, something that appears to be pretty common with bladder tanks. In fact, the Betz sphere's lack of any points of attachment also rules out most other outer space explanations, like a downed Russian satellite similar to Sputnik. If Sputnik's antennas had fallen off, there would still have been points of connection to the sphere. In that vein, while the Betz's ball was far from the first or last sphere to crash out of the darkness of space, most, if not all, of the other ones have some kind of marking on them, be it a seam, threaded screw fitting, or other obvious way for the item to connect to a larger thing. The same applies to undersea spheres like cast iron sinkers and tide and current transcribers. So the Betz sphere lacking any of these indicators makes it hard to put it into the bladder tank or sea marker category. There's also a theory that it was a marker that would sit on the ocean floor in a fixed position and help submarines navigate, and this seems to be based on Dr. Carl Williston's statement that the sphere emitted radio signals. However, it's unclear why the Navy wouldn't have taken it back, and if it actually did move by itself, why a marker to help with positioning would move around on its own. Now, if this technology did exist, maybe the sphere moved so it could keep correcting its position relative to the water trying to move it, but then we're back to why didn't the Navy take it back? So now, let's get a little weird. Beginning in the early 1940s, military personnel described seeing glowing spheres following and keeping pace with their aircraft. The most famous report coming in November of 1944 from the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, who was flying along the Rhine River in Germany when they reported seeing 8 to 10 bright orange lights off the left wing flying through the air at high speed. The objects appeared alone or in groups as many as 10, but didn't show up on radar. There was fear that they were some type of remote-controlled weapon used by the Germans, but the orbs never tried to harm the pilots or damage their planes. Some theorized that the lights were St. Elmo's fire, which is a bright, glowing plasma display that happens when electrically charged atmosphere discharges on pointed objects like ship masts, chimneys, or portions of aircraft. However, the orbs these pilots saw appeared to dart around and maneuver in a way that St. Elmo's fire could not. And in case you were thinking, somehow this video must play into something relevant to pop culture, those unexplained lights came to be known as Foo Fighters, because they had the same dazzling gleam as Dave Grohl's smile. Because these Foo Fighters appeared to be spheres that moved in a surprising and mysterious way, some wondered if the Betz sphere was a downed Foo Fighter, still able to roll around a little bit under its own power, but needing to make its way back home and learn to fly. Leaving the Foo Fighters puns behind, we can't really debunk this one because we don't know what the orbs the pilots were seeing really were. But we also have no reason to believe that they were the Betz sphere either. Now, of course, there are also some theories that suggest the sphere was a dummy warhead. After all, the Betzes had a relative who was the head of General Electric's atomic division in New York, and that's what he thought it was. And that's honestly what I thought it was from the moment we started this video. Another theory was that it was part of an inertial navigation system, which involves gyroscopes and motion sensors to track an object's location without needing external references. These involve complex internal electronics, though, which the Betz sphere didn't have. And finally, there's the theory that it is somehow a remnant of an ancient atomic bomb used against Earth, either by aliens or a lost civilization like Atlantis. This theory seems to be inspired by Erich von Daniken's 1968 book, Chariots of the Gods, where von Daniken wonders if ancient religions, technology, and art are the result of aliens visiting Earth, rather than these cultures being capable and intelligent enough to create these works on their own. You may have heard some of his ideas from the show Ancient Aliens, where, they say things about how the Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, contains references to celestial aircraft or flying chariots, as well as weapons that were so bright and caused so much destruction they sound like nuclear bombs. And here Bethany actually wrote, this could be its own video, but suffice to say that, at least in the Betz's case, this sphere was shiny enough that it probably wasn't from an ancient world-destroying battle. I have been kicking around doing some videos on how Ancient Aliens lies to you, so that's probably coming. But with that, we've gone through the most common explanations for what the Betz sphere is. And many of them, like the ball check valve, require the assumption that the Betzes were either lying or misinterpreting the sphere's movements. But what if they weren't? Frankly, it would be easier to write them off if Lottie Robinson hadn't thrown her ball in the ring, because the speed with which the Robinson sphere was identified by mill technicians as something coming from a ball check valve throws the Betz sphere into stark contrast. Why wasn't theirs so readily identified too? If it's so obvious that this is just a ball bearing, why couldn't anybody notice that? I mean, it was theorized to be a ball check valve part, but as far as our research could go, no one from a paper mill ever directly confirmed that. It also bears repeating that the Betzes never stated they thought the sphere was alien in any way. Yes, Terry told the National Enquirer that he would like for it to be from outer space, but that's different from believing it was from outer space. He also finished that statement with, "I'm open to any opinion." When others suggested that the sphere might be alien, Jerry's response was a neutral, "Who could say what's on another planet? Even speculations have been proven wrong." The Tampa Bay Times reported that some neighbors posited the sphere was a bugging device left by UFOs, to which Jerry Betz responded, "If no other explanation can be found, that's as logical as any," but she typically stated something along the lines of, "I just want to know what this is, period." Antoine, for his part, was home when the sphere was found, and as a maritime engineer, he and his colleagues were confused by what the hell the ball was. Jerry had taught herself the mechanics of tractor trailers, so she wasn't new to machinery either, but something about this sphere made both of them take pause. Now, the easiest conclusion to come to is that the Betzes were lying, but that just doesn't sit right. Even if you discard most of their claims, the strangers who tried to buy the sphere weren't foreign government agents, they were just weirdos. J. Allen Hynek told the Betzes what he thought they wanted to hear so he could get access to the ball, then realized it wasn't a big deal. The Navy saw the sphere as mundane and never tried to get it back. There's still a bizarre story here, but it might not be the one we think it is. Most people write the Betz sphere off as a ball check valve. Let's say that's correct. The fact that so many big names from UFO history in America, the media, and the military came together to hype up a metal ball used every day in thousands of machine parts is nuts. That's crazy. Maybe it's just because it took hours and hours and hours of listening to interviews with people involved in the story. Maybe they radicalized us, but the Betzes just don't seem like liars. And especially since there didn't seem to be any motivation for lying. They weren't looking for money, they weren't looking for fame. Everything that somebody doing something like this for attention would do, they did the opposite. And they did the opposite quickly, and they were already well off, and the only thing this could do was hurt their reputation. It just, for an entire family to go into some kind of psychosis like that is hard to believe. If this was an individual person, if it was just Jerry, maybe, but it's the whole family. So the point is, there doesn't seem to be a good motivation for lying about this ball. But if we're going with the assumption that the sphere did not move on its own, there is something that might explain what happened. You see, the sphere was shiny and it wasn't covered by years of forest growth, meaning that it almost certainly recently dropped where it was found. Meanwhile, Jerry had just ordered some fire trails to be cut, meaning that heavy machinery had moved through the area. Now, apparently stainless steel isn't really common in industrial machinery, as those industries prefer carbon and chrome steel, so it's unlikely that the ball fell from one of the bulldozers or tractors. But stainless steel is used in medical and marine systems because it resists corrosion, so let's say the sphere was from a ball check valve off a piece of industrial machinery that was either discarded in the marshy banks and moved inland, or some kid found it, thought it was cool, realized it was too heavy to carry around, and dropped it. That time did have ferry, military, and commercial maritime traffic, and all of the machinery that goes with it, likely including a large stainless steel ball for a check valve or other purpose. So if it is a ball from a valve, then most likely circumstance is someone found it, thought it was cool, but too heavy and ultimately dropped it, after which Terry found it, and then the castle's subtly uneven floors resulted in the perfectly balanced ball moving from the slightest change in the floor or table. But remember that Florida Times-Union newspaper article that was written about Jerry and the castle? The Halloween article? Jerry tells a story. She said that when she first bought the house, a local transportation attorney told her to look into the Supreme Court records regarding the house because, as he told her, "I know you like a mystery." We never find out what he meant by that, by the way, because true to how this entire research process went, he passed away before he could explain anything. But his statement to Jerry, "I know you like a mystery," could be the crux of this entire story. So let's assume that the Betz family was not lying about this sphere. Nothing they said the ball did was impossible. The ball never floated or hovered, it rolled. Yes, it rolled uphill under its own power, it changed directions, it stopped itself before rolling off a table edge, but all of those things are mechanical possibilities. Officially recognized X-rays performed by the Navy showed that it had smaller spheres inside of it, as well as some kind of a thin filament. We've said before on this channel how military tech is so much more advanced than people could imagine. It's decades ahead of what we think it is. So how unrealistic is it that a ball could roll around and stop itself with just the elements inside of it? Sidebar to that, it could be very unrealistic. We have a wide variety of skill sets and education among our team members at Redacted Media, with some of us having engineering and mechanical know-how, but obviously none of us are defense contractors. Although we do know a defense contractor, and now I have questions for her. All that being said though, no one's behavior in this story seems like a proportionate response to a ball check valve. I mean, like, let's be very honest, it's been 50 years. If it was just a ball check valve, surely that would have occurred to the family. And yet, Jerry gave a written statement to the Astonishing Legends podcast, which includes this line about the sphere. Our desire to understand what it was became overshadowed by the chaos and exhaustion that seemed to be a huge part of the equation. If it's a lot of chaos and everything, you should really want it to be over. Acknowledging that it's just a ball check valve part really seems like the way to finish it. Like the sheer pressure of 50 years of people insisting to you that it's just a ball check valve. You'd think you'd eventually convince yourself it is. Or if it was a lie, then someone probably would have cracked at some point and said, yeah, the whole it moving thing, I'm not really sure that ever happened. That might have been us, our brains playing tricks on us, or somebody said it happened, but I wasn't there and I heard about it. Like, you'd think, right? But that never happened with Jerry. She loved a mystery and wanted to get to the bottom of this one. She also never backed down on her claim that this sphere moved on its own, and that it was strange, even at the risk of re-whipping up attention on the sphere and her family, which is something that she is clearly taking great pains to avoid in the multiple decades since these events. And that should mean something. Her statement goes on to say, and I quote, I think it is important for people to understand that any suggestion of a hoax implies we were either claiming something to be true that was not, or we manipulated this sphere to perform tricks. Neither is true. We shared our observations and allowed this sphere to be examined, studied, and tested. The odd behavior which we reported was filmed and documented by outside parties, and the behaviors were substantiated. End quote. Now, there's zero evidence that these videos exist, besides people saying they do, and yet Jerry doesn't equivocate or make excuses. She said that they all saw what they saw, take it or leave it. Bethany, our writer for this one, believes that it was a piece of military tech, some kind of prototype that either worked alone or as part of a larger thing, and probably a navigation system. Didn't end up getting used, or maybe testing resulted in an accident that sent pieces flying off hither and yon, and the ball survived. The Navy then realized their mistake after they'd returned the sphere, but now Jerry refused to give it back to them, and the Navy, claiming it as their property, would reveal this advanced tech. J. Allen Hynek had an existing relationship with the military in general, and perhaps he was asked to either swap it out with something they made as a dummy, or he was asked to publicly dismiss the sphere to prevent this type of prototype from being publicized. That might sound over the top, but believing that a ball from a valve tricked a family that was able to live in a purportedly haunted house without issue into thinking they'd found some kind of advanced tech seems just as unlikely. Additionally, this incident truly appears to have caused all of the Betz's significant distress and exhaustion, so Jerry could have easily conceded and said, you know what, it was a ball check valve. You guys were right, now please go away, like I just said. But she didn't. Remember, Jerry protected her sources during a deposition, even when faced with possible jail time, which shows that she stuck to her guns even if it cost her personally. And it seems like that's what she did here too. We don't know what it is that they found, but we think they found something, not from outer space, but as the Navy spokesman said, from Earth. So why did this become such a big deal? Well, this was a time in history in which people were obsessed with aliens. The 60s saw the Betty and Barney Hill story, possibly the most famous abduction story up until Travis Walton in 1975. There were reports of UFO sightings from France, Australia, Canada, and all over the US. And 2 years before the Betz sphere, a teen boy in Japan, and later a group of his friends, all reportedly witnessed a miniature craft they said hovered around and evaded their capture. And when they later found it lying on the ground, they felt something moving inside. 1 year after the Betz's discovery, the US saw one of the largest waves of reported UFO sightings in its history, including that fall, which became known as the Autumn of Aliens. So for those reasons, we don't think that the Betzes found alien tech, but we do think it's possible that they found some piece of advanced American tech. And because people were already primed to think aliens, the story quickly got away from them and kept everyone from finding out what the Betzes actually discovered. Now, that is the end of the scripted portion of this show, but of course, I have thoughts of my own. And I'm actually mostly with Bethany on this one. While I can't be certain precisely what kind of technology this will be a part of, because I'm just not in that world at all, I do think it seems most likely that this was part of military, aeronautical, or oceanographic study, or potentially part of a weapon. As for the reason I struggle to agree that it was just a ball bearing or something from a ball check valve, those parts are manufactured en masse, and you would think that if this was getting so much media attention, then somebody somewhere in the country would have come out and said, hey, I work for such and such company and we make those. Just looking at the object itself and the way it's described, there are a couple of things to come to mind. Some are nuclear fuel. I don't know the proper terminology here, but I'm just going to say nuclear fuel spheres, and I'm assuming that people who work in nuclear energy are going to understand what I'm talking about there. So that could be one thing. The fact that it was hollow on the inside could suggest that there was supposed to be something in it that wasn't in it. It could have been that it was an experimental part or that it was a proof of concept for something. If that were the case, it would explain why the Navy was trying to get their hands on it again. At the same time, I feel like the Navy in the 1970s probably could have just grabbed it and said, this is ours, the media is not talking about it. Thinking about the fact that there was no seams and yet it was hollow would suggest to me that maybe it was cast, and then that little triangular stamp was placed on top of wherever they sanded off the opening for pouring it into whatever they were casting. That's really all I can come up with, though, and it does not explain why there was stuff inside of it. It does sound like there was definitely something that happened at the National Enquirer Blue Ribbon thing. Maybe they did swap it out. Maybe it was with the government orchestrating the whole thing. Maybe it was just Hynek. Who knows? That also could just be the Betz family's way of explaining why it stopped moving, and why they couldn't prove that it did the things it does. But then again, we come back to the issue of they don't seem like they were lying. So unfortunately, this seems like one of those stories where either we're going to find out in some disclosure thing, in some tranche of just files getting released, and it's like, hey, these are cool now, they don't matter. Of course, if that were the case, you would have expected those to come out in the most recent one, because this was from 1974, and typically it's about 50 years. Who knows? Maybe this is related to aliens. Maybe it's related to nuclear weapons. Maybe it's just a ball check valve. But it's really fascinating that this entire story got as much attention as it did, and there was just never any conclusion to it. The ball just disappeared. Or at least the story of the ball did, because the ball that came back wasn't the same as the ball that went away. So I'm inclined to believe that the Betzes were telling the truth. Anything beyond that, I do not feel confident expressing an opinion on. Now, of course, this was a difficult story to research, so if there was something that was missed, please do let us know in the comments. If you happen to have evidence, if you happen to know a member of the Betz family, if there's something you think that we should know that we could later update and say, hey guys, we figured this out, please do let us know. We do make updates as frequently as possible, whether it's something that we got wrong, something that we said and then there were new developments, whatever that is. So we do genuinely appreciate that. Now, if you want to support what we're doing, first of all, head over to our Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge and join that, because that is the only place you're going to get consistent updates about when videos go out and stuff like that. Obviously, like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. We appreciate all of those things, but YouTube doesn't really pay attention to any of those things as part of the algorithm anymore. What are they paying attention to? I don't know. But yeah, do everything you can to tell YouTube you do in fact want to see our videos, because apparently subscribing isn't enough anymore. But other than subscribing to the Discord so you make sure that you're seeing the videos in their free version whenever possible, you can also join our Patreon for just $1 a month. You get access to ad-free versions of these videos. And if you go on Pepperbox, which is $8 a month, well, then you get access to these ad-free videos, and you also get an exclusive series. It's called American Monster. That is about serial killers, and you get those, like I said, ad-free, they're exclusive, and then you get access to everybody else on Pepperbox's platform for that same $8. So it's one $8 a month subscription, gets you access to dozens of creators and all of our exclusive content. Which, to be fair, what I mean by exclusive content is the only the people on that platform get it kind, not the Aiden and I have a special room full of stuff kind. I mean, we do, but we don't film it. If you would like to do something that involves consuming physical content, well, you can do that by going to tableauroastingco.com and ordering Mount Pocono Perk, our signature coffee blend that I designed myself. I did not pull it off of a shelf and rebrand it. I told Matthew Moore exactly what flavors I wanted and exactly what beans and where I wanted them from, and he gave it to me. So you can rest assured it is a coffee blend designed by people who genuinely love coffee. If you look at the comments of this video, there's probably going to be somebody telling you it's the best coffee they've ever had. In addition to that, if you would like to, feel like you're wearing our skin, you can do that by going to Bunker Branding and purchasing our clothing. We've got a new design coming up, I think. It's not gonna make sense, but it will be good. It will make sense if you're familiar with a certain 2006 film. I think 2006. Somewhere in there. It's National Treasure Book of Secrets. And then, of course, if you'd like more Lodge, this list keeps growing. There's obviously this right here, the Lore Lodge. We have our podcast, the Lore Lads. We also have our other podcast, History Unhinged. We also have our other podcast, The Weird Bible. Then, of course, we have Thornbury's show, Silver Attention, where he dives into the various backstories of how movies were made. I believe they're starting a Silver Retention podcast as well. I won't be a part of that because I don't know anything about movies. And we now have fully relaunched what used to be my personal streaming channel as a gaming channel. It is now called the LAN Lads, and that is LAN Lodge? Might be LAN Lodge. Probably the LAN Lodge. And that is, well, the LAN Lodge. So if you go and you find that, I'll put a link in the description to it, and you can watch us play video games. Usually for your entertainment. Whew, that was a long outro segment. With all of that said, I am Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.